The dust hung thick in the air as Penelope Price gripped the reins of her wagon with white knuckles, the steep drop to her right seeming to pull at the wheels like a hungry beast. The year was 1873, and the journey west had been nothing like the romantic adventure novels she'd devoured back in Boston. Now, teetering on this narrow pass high above Wyoming Territory's unforgiving landscape, she understood why they called this treacherous stretch Widowmaker Road. A sickening crack split the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of splintering wood. The wagon lurched violently, tilting toward the precipice as the right rear wheel collapsed. "Whoa, steady!" Penelope cried, frantically pulling back on the reins as her two horses stamped nervously, sensing the danger. The wagon slid another inch toward the edge, rocks skittering down the cliff face into the vast emptiness below. Panic seized her throat. 300 miles from Boston, 60 miles from the nearest settlement, and now stranded on a mountain pass with a broken wagon and nightfall approaching. This wasn't how her journey to Council Bluffs was supposed to unfold. A cloud of dust appeared in the distance, and Penelope squinted against the setting sun. A lone rider approached, his silhouette growing larger against the orange sky. She reached for the small pistol tucked beneath her seat, wrapping her fingers around its grip. The West had taught her caution, if nothing else. The stranger pulled his horse to a halt several yards from her wagon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind beneath the wide brim of his hat. Not young, but not old either, perhaps 30 or so, with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Looks like you've got yourself in quite a predicament, madam," he called, his voice carrying a gentle drawl. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the dirt. "The wheel broke," Penelope said, stating the obvious while keeping her hand near the hidden pistol. "I was heading to Council Bluffs." The stranger approached slowly, hands visible. "That's still a fair piece from here. Name's Ryder Quinn," he said, removing his hat briefly. "Cattle driver, was heading back that way myself." He circled the wagon, inspecting the damage with a practiced eye. "Penelope Price," she replied, relaxing slightly but remaining vigilant. Ryder crouched by the broken wheel, running his fingers along the splintered wood. "This axle's shot. No fixing it out here." He glanced at the darkening sky. "And we don't want to be on this pass come nightfall. What do you suggest, Mr. Quinn?" Penelope asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Ryder stood, dusting off his hands. "We can't leave you here, and that wagon ain't going nowhere." His eyes met hers, direct and honest. "You'll ride my horse the rest of the way. I'll walk alongside and lead him. And my belongings?" She asked, looking at the trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. "We'll take what you can't live without. I know folks in Council Bluffs who can come back for the rest." He glanced at the precarious tilt of the wagon. "Though I'd wager this wagon might be at the bottom of the canyon by then." Penelope hesitated, weighing her options, which were, in truth, non-existent. Stay and risk death, or trust this stranger named Ryder Quinn. "I don't have much choice, do I?" she said finally. "No, madam, you don't." His mouth curved into a slight smile. "But I promise you'll be safer with me than with that broken wheel." As the last light faded from the sky, Penelope gathered her most precious possessions, her father's pocket watch, the letters from her late mother, a small box of jewelry, and a change of clothes. Everything else would have to wait. Ryder helped her unhitch her horses and secured them behind his own. Then he offered his hand to help her mount his stallion, a magnificent chestnut animal that stood at least 17 hands high. "This is Thunder," he said, as she settled nervously in the saddle. "Best horse in Wyoming Territory. He'll carry you safe." "What about you?" she asked, suddenly aware of how close they were, his hand still steadying her on the horse. "I've walked harder trails than this," Ryder said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Besides, we've only got about 5 miles to go before we reach Blackwater Creek. There's a trading post there where we can rest for the night." With a final glance at her abandoned wagon, Penelope nodded. Ryder took Thunder's reins, and they began their slow journey down the mountain pass, the shadows growing longer with each step. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the sound of hooves and the occasional call of a night bird. Penelope studied Ryder's back as he led the way, his gait steady and purposeful. There was something reassuring about his presence, a quiet confidence that made her feel, for the first time since leaving Boston, that perhaps she wasn't entirely alone in this vast wilderness. "May I ask what brings a lady like yourself all the way from the east?" Ryder asked after a while, glancing back at her. Penelope hesitated. Her reasons were her own, painful and private, but something about the gathering darkness and this stranger's unexpected kindness loosened her tongue. "My father died 6 months ago," she said quietly. "Left nothing but debts. I received a letter from my aunt in Council Bluffs offering me a place to stay." She didn't mention the broken engagement, the scandal that had followed, or how Boston had suddenly seemed to suffocate her with its whispers and sidelong glances. Ryder nodded, seeming to understand there was more to her story than she was sharing. "Council Bluffs is growing fast. Good place for new beginnings. And you, Mr. Quinn, what's your story?" she asked, grateful to shift the conversation. "No story worth telling," he said with a soft chuckle. "Been driving cattle up from Texas to Wyoming for 10 years now. Just delivered a herd to a ranch near Cheyenne." He paused, thinking it might be my last drive, though, getting too old to sleep on the ground for months at a time. "What will you do instead?" "Got a small piece of land outside Council Bluffs. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. Thought I might settle down, raise horses instead of chasing cattle." His voice held a note of wistfulness. Never really had a proper home before. Something in his tone touched Penelope. Here was a man who had spent his life wandering, just as she was now forced to do. But while her journey was born of necessity and shame, his seemed to be reaching its conclusion. The trading post at Blackwater Creek appeared as a cluster of yellow lights in the distance. Penelope felt a rush of relief, her body aching from the tension of the day's events. The post was little more than a large cabin with a stable attached, but it looked like a palace to Penelope's exhausted eyes. A grizzled man with a long beard emerged as they approached. "Ryder Quinn. Didn't expect to see you till next season," he called. "Change of plans, Silas," Ryder replied, helping Penelope dismount. "This is Miss Price. Her wagon broke on the cliff road. We need rooms for the night." Silas's bushy eyebrows rose slightly as he looked at Penelope, but he nodded. "Got 1 room left. You can take the back storage room, Ryder." Inside, the trading post was warm and surprisingly clean. A few travelers sat around a large table, eating a simple meal. Penelope felt their curious glances, but kept her head high as she followed Silas to a small room off the main hall. "Ain't much, but it's dry and the bed's clean," Silas said, lighting a lamp on a small table. "Supper's still hot if you're hungry." Left alone, Penelope sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The events of the day crashed over her, the terror of the broken wheel, the prospect of death on that lonely pass, and the unexpected appearance of Ryder Quinn. Tears threatened, but she blinked them back. She hadn't cried when her father died, nor when Edward had broken their engagement upon learning of her family's financial ruin. She wouldn't cry now. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Ryder stood there, holding a tray with a steaming bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. Thought you might be too tired to join the others, he said, setting the tray on the small table. You should eat something. The simple kindness, so unexpected, so undeserved, nearly broke her composure. Thank you, she managed. He lingered in the doorway. We'll start early tomorrow. It's about a day's ride to Council Bluffs from here. Your aunt's name, I might know her. Margaret Patterson, Penelope replied. My mother's sister. A strange expression crossed Ryder's face. Maggie Patterson owns the millinery shop on Front Street, Penelope nodded, surprised. You know her? Everyone in Council Bluffs knows Maggie, he said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Get some rest, Miss Price. Tomorrow will be a long day. After he left, Penelope ate the stew, finding it surprisingly good. As she prepared for bed, she wondered about Ryder's reaction to her aunt's name. There had been something there, recognition, certainly, but something else too, something that made her uneasy. Sleep claimed her quickly, but her dreams were troubled, filled with broken wagons, endless roads, and the enigmatic gaze of a cowboy who had appeared from nowhere to rescue her. Morning came too soon, the pale light filtering through the small window. Penelope dressed quickly in her simplest traveling dress, her mind focused on the journey ahead. One more day, and she would reach Council Bluffs, the destination that had consumed her thoughts for months. One more day with the mysterious Ryder Quinn. She found him in the main room, already awake and deep in conversation with Silas. Both men fell silent as she approached, which did nothing to ease her growing sense that something was amiss. Good morning, Miss Price, Ryder said, standing. Hope you slept well. Well enough, thank you, she replied, studying his face for any clue to his thoughts. I've settled our bill and got some provisions for the journey, he continued. If you're ready, we should get moving. Want to make good time today. Outside, Thunder stood saddled and ready, along with another horse, a dappled gray mare. Borrowed Stella here from Silas, Ryder explained. Figured you'd be more comfortable riding your own mount today. It's a longer journey than yesterday. Penelope was touched by his consideration. That's very kind. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Ryder said with a wry smile. That mare's got a stubborn streak wider than the Missouri River. Their journey began in companionable silence, the trail winding through pine forests and across shallow streams. The late summer sun warmed the air, and Penelope found herself relaxing for the first time in days. The mare, despite Ryder's warning, proved to be gentle and responsive. You ride well, Ryder observed after a few hours. Not many Eastern ladies do. My father insisted, Penelope replied. He said a lady should know how to ride properly, not just perch on a saddle looking decorative. The memory brought a smile to her face. For all his faults, and there had been many, her father had never treated her as fragile or incapable. Wise man, Ryder said. Then, after a pause, Miss Price, there's something I should tell you about Council Bluffs. The seriousness in his tone made her stomach tighten. What about it? Ryder adjusted his hat, clearly uncomfortable. It's changed a lot in recent years. The railroad coming through has brought all sorts good and bad. It's not quite the peaceful little town your aunt might have described. I'm not expecting a paradise, Mr. Quinn, she said, a little defensively. I'm well aware that life in the West is different from Boston. It's not just that, he persisted. There's been trouble lately, land disputes with the railroad companies, some violence, he glanced at her. Your aunt's property sits on land the railroad wants. She's been vocal about her refusal to sell, Penelope frowned. Is she in danger? Not directly, no. Maggie Patterson's well respected in town. But there's tension. I just want you to be prepared. I appreciate your concern, Penelope said, though his words had sent a chill through her. She had imagined Council Bluffs as her sanctuary, a place to rebuild her life far from Boston's painful memories. The idea that she might be stepping into yet another difficult situation was disheartening. They stopped for a brief lunch beside a clear stream, sharing the bread, cheese, and dried fruit Silas had provided. Penelope watched as Ryder moved around the small camp, efficient and self-contained. He fascinated her, this man who seemed so at home in the wilderness, yet spoke with an education she hadn't expected. "You mentioned yesterday that you have land near Council Bluffs," she said as they ate. "Have you owned it long?" Ryder nodded. "About 5 years now. Bought it with savings from cattle drives. Haven't spent much time there yet, but that's changing now." "And do you have family waiting for you?" The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. A shadow crossed his face. "No family, not anymore." The simple statement held volumes of untold history. Penelope recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when speaking of her own past. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to pry." Ryder's expression softened. "No harm done, just old ghosts." He stood, brushing crumbs from his hands. "We should move on if we want to reach town before nightfall." As they continued their journey, the landscape gradually changed. The wild, rocky terrain gave way to rolling prairie, and occasional homesteads began to appear, signs of civilization that both comforted and unsettled Penelope. Each mile brought her closer to her new life, yet further from the independence she'd felt on the open trail with Ryder. Late in the afternoon, they crested a gentle hill and Ryder pulled his horse to a halt. "There it is," he said, gesturing ahead. "Council Bluffs, Iowa." Penelope shaded her eyes against the sun. In the distance, nestled near the banks of a broad river, lay a town larger than she had expected. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could make out the steeples of several churches. On the far side, a railroad trestle spanned the water. "The Missouri River," Ryder explained, seeing her gaze. "That's Omaha on the other side in Nebraska territory. The railroad bridge connects them now." "It's bigger than I imagined," Penelope admitted, a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "About 8,000 souls now and growing every day. Like I said, the railroad changed everything." He glanced at her. "Your aunt's shop is on Front Street, the main thoroughfare. I'll take you there directly." As they rode into town, Penelope felt the stares of passers-by. A woman traveling alone with a man who wasn't her husband or brother would naturally attract attention. She sat straighter in her saddle, chin raised. Let them stare. After what she'd endured in Boston, a few curious looks were nothing. Front Street was bustling with activity despite the late hour. Wagons and carriages moved up and down the wide dirt road, while pedestrians crowded the wooden sidewalks. Shops lined both sides: a general store, a bank, a hotel, and numerous smaller establishments. Ryder guided them to a neat 2-story building with large display windows. A sign above the door read "Patterson's Millinery." "Here we are," Ryder said, dismounting and then helping Penelope down from her horse. "Your aunt's shop and home. She lives in the apartment upstairs." Penelope smoothed her travel-stained dress, suddenly self-conscious. What would her aunt think of her arriving like this, escorted by a cowboy she'd met just yesterday? The shop door opened, and a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked dark hair stepped out. She wore a fashionable dress of deep burgundy, and her eyes, the same hazel as Penelope's mother's, had been widened in surprise. "Penelope," she exclaimed, "we weren't expecting you for another week." Her gaze shifted to Ryder and a complex expression crossed her face. "Mr. Quinn, this is unexpected." "Mrs. Patterson," Ryder said, removing his hat. "Found your niece stranded on Widowmaker Pass yesterday. Her wagon broke down. Thought it best to escort her here directly." Margaret Patterson's eyebrows rose, but she quickly composed herself. "How fortunate you were there, Mr. Quinn. Please, both of you, come inside. You must be exhausted, Penelope." The interior of the shop was cool and smelled pleasantly of lavender and starch. Beautiful hats sat on stands and shelves, creations of lace, feathers, and ribbons that would not have looked out of place in the finest Boston establishments. Margaret led them through the shop to a back staircase. "My assistant has already gone home for the day, so we'll have privacy upstairs," she said over her shoulder. The apartment above the shop was surprisingly spacious and elegantly furnished. Large windows overlooked Front Street, filling the rooms with late afternoon light. Penelope felt a rush of relief. This was civilized, familiar, a place where she might indeed find the fresh start she sought. "Sit down, both of you," Margaret insisted, gesturing to a comfortable parlor. "I'll make tea and you can tell me everything." "Penelope, your room is prepared, though as I said, we weren't expecting you quite yet." As Margaret busied herself in the small kitchen, Penelope turned to Ryder, who stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hand. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Just glad I was there when you needed help." A silence stretched between them, filled with things unsaid. "I should go," he added finally. "Let you settle in with your aunt." A surprising pang of loss shot through Penelope. This man had been a stranger 2 days ago, yet somehow the thought of his departure left her feeling adrift. "Of course," she managed. "But perhaps. That is, I hope we might see each other again so I can properly thank you." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Council Bluffs is a small town, Miss Price. I imagine our paths will cross again." He turned to leave just as Margaret returned with a tea tray. "You're not staying, Mr. Quinn?" Margaret asked, her tone neutral. "No, madam. Need to get these horses settled, and I've been away from my place too long as it is." He nodded politely to both women. "Miss Price, Mrs. Patterson." After he left, Margaret poured tea for them both, her movements precise and controlled. Penelope sensed there was more to her aunt's reaction to Ryder than simple surprise. "He seems like a good man," Penelope ventured. "I was fortunate he came along when he did." Margaret's expression was unreadable. "Yes, fortunate indeed." She sipped her tea, then set the cup down decisively. "Penelope, there's something you should know about Ryder Quinn." Penelope's heart skipped. "What is it?" Her aunt's eyes were kind but serious. "He was once engaged to your cousin Louisa." The statement hung in the air, unexpected and jarring. Penelope struggled to process it. "Louisa? But she's married to a banker in Chicago. She has been for years." "Yes, she is now," Margaret agreed. "But before that, she and Ryder were to be married, until she broke it off to accept Mr. Hargrove's proposal instead." "I had no idea," Penelope murmured, thinking of the shadow that had crossed Ryder's face when she'd asked about family. Was he very hurt?" Margaret sighed. "It was 5 years ago now. Ryder had just bought that land he mentioned, planning to build a life with Louisa. When she left, he went back to driving cattle. This is the first time in years he's stayed in Council Bluffs for more than a few days." She studied Penelope's face. "I just thought you should know, given the circumstances of your arrival together." Penelope nodded slowly, piecing together this new information. "Is that why you seemed surprised to see him?" "Partly," Margaret admitted. "Though more surprised to see him with you. Ryder has kept his distance from our family since Louisa left." She reached across the table to take Penelope's hand. "But enough about ancient history. Tell me about your journey, and your father. I was so sorry to hear of his passing." For the next hour, Penelope recounted the events that had led her to Council Bluffs, her father's death, the discovery of his debts, and the broken engagement. She omitted some details, unwilling to reveal the full extent of her humiliation. but Margaret seemed to understand nonetheless. "You've been through quite an ordeal," her aunt said when she finished. "But you're safe now, and you have a home here for as long as you need it." She smiled. "And the shop could use another pair of hands if you're interested in learning the millinery trade." "I'd like that," Penelope said, genuine gratitude washing over her. The prospect of useful work, of contributing rather than merely existing as a burden, was more appealing than her aunt could know. That night, lying in the comfortable bed in her new room, Penelope found her thoughts returning again and again to Ryder Quinn. The revelation of his past with her cousin cast their brief acquaintance in a new light. Had he known who she was from the moment she mentioned her aunt? Was that why he had seemed troubled, and what did it mean for any future encounters between them? Council Bluffs was indeed small, as he had said. They would inevitably see each other again. The thought both excited and unsettled her. Outside her window, the sounds of the town gradually quieted as night deepened. So different from the wilderness of the previous evening, yet in its way just as foreign to her. Penelope closed her eyes, trying to imagine what the coming days might hold. Her last conscious thought was of Ryder's face, as he'd helped her mount thunder on that precarious mountain pass, concerned yet confident. His eyes meeting hers with unspoken reassurance that somehow everything would be all right. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Margaret introduced Penelope to the workings of the shop. Emily Foster, her aunt's assistant, was a cheerful young woman who patiently showed Penelope how to steam and shape the felt bodies that would become elegant hats. "You have good hands for this work," Emily observed as Penelope successfully blocked her first hat form. "Took me weeks to get that right." Margaret nodded approvingly. "It's in the blood. Your mother was skilled with a needle too." The mention of her mother brought a pang of grief, but Penelope welcomed it. Here, among her mother's family, she could remember the good times rather than just the painful end. The morning passed quickly, filled with customers and conversations. Penelope was surprised by how many people already seemed to know who she was. News traveled fast in Council Bluffs. Most were welcoming, though she noticed a few curious glances and whispered comments. "Don't mind Mrs. Caldwell and her friends," Margaret said after a particularly obvious huddle of ladies had left the shop. "They thrive on gossip, and a new face is always fodder for speculation." "What are they saying?" Penelope asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Margaret and Emily exchanged glances. "Well," Emily said hesitantly, "there's talk about you arriving with Ryder Quinn. He's something of a figure of interest in town." "Because of Louisa," Penelope guessed. Emily looked surprised. "You know about that? I told her last night," Margaret explained. "Better she hear it from me than from town gossips." "It's more than just that old story," Emily continued. "Ryder's been involved in the dispute with the railroad. He's one of the landowners refusing to sell, and he's been helping others fight back against the company's strong-arm tactics." "Strong-arm tactics," Penelope echoed. Margaret's expression hardened. "The Pacific Railroad wants to expand its facilities here. They've been buying up property all along the riverfront or trying to. Those of us who won't sell have faced pressure." "What kind of pressure?" Penelope asked, concerned. "Nothing illegal, not quite," her aunt replied. "Mysterious property damage, suddenly difficult banking relationships, suppliers who won't deliver." She waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing we can't handle. And we have support. Ryder's been organizing the holdouts, helping us stand together." The bell over the shop door jingled, interrupting their conversation. A tall, imposing man in an expensive suit entered, removing his hat to reveal thinning hair and cold eyes. "Mrs. Patterson," he said with a tight smile. "I was passing by and thought I'd inquire whether you've reconsidered my company's offer." Margaret's spine straightened. "Mr. Hollister, how unexpected. I believe I made my position quite clear at our last meeting." The man Hollister glanced around the shop, his gaze lingering on Penelope. "Indeed. However, circumstances change. I understand you have family visiting now." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Another mouth to feed might alter your financial calculations." "My niece, Penelope Price," Margaret said coolly. "Penelope, this is Victor Hollister, the Pacific Railroad's land agent." Penelope nodded stiffly, immediately disliking the calculating look in the man's eyes. "A pleasure, Miss Price," Hollister said. "I hope you'll enjoy your stay in our growing community." He turned back to Margaret. "My offer stands for 1 more week, Mrs. Patterson. After that, I'm afraid the price will necessarily decrease, given the deteriorating conditions in this part of town." With that thinly veiled threat, he replaced his hat and left the shop. "Deteriorating conditions?" Penelope asked once he was gone. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "There have been several unexplained fires in nearby businesses recently. Nothing proven, of course." "That's outrageous," Penelope exclaimed. "Can't something be done?" "Sheriff Miller is sympathetic but claims he needs evidence," Emily said. "And Mayor Collins is firmly in the railroad's pocket." Margaret patted Penelope's hand. "Don't worry about it, dear. We've handled worse." Her smile was determined. "Now, let's get back to work. I have an order to finish for Mrs. Judge Wilson by tomorrow." Despite her aunt's reassurances, Penelope found herself troubled by the encounter. The casual way Hollister had threatened her aunt, and by extension, herself, revealed a dangerous undercurrent to Council Bluffs' prosperous facade. That evening, after Emily had gone home and they had closed the shop, Margaret invited Penelope to accompany her to a meeting. "Some of the property owners are gathering at the Mitchell Hotel to discuss strategy," she explained. "It would be good for you to understand the situation, since you're living here now." The Mitchell Hotel's private dining room was already filled with people when they arrived. Penelope recognized some faces from the shop that day, while others were strangers. And there, deep in conversation with an elderly man near the fireplace, stood Ryder Quinn. He looked different in town clothes, a clean white shirt, dark vest, and well-worn but polished boots. His hair was neatly combed, though still longer than Boston fashion would dictate. When he glanced up and saw her, his conversation faltered momentarily. Margaret led Penelope to 2 empty chairs, greeting people as they passed. Several curious glances were directed at Penelope, but most seemed too preoccupied with the meeting's purpose to pay her much attention. A tall, distinguished man with a silver beard called the gathering to order. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. For those who don't know me, I'm Judge Elias Foster, Emily's father," he added with a nod toward Penelope. "We have several matters to discuss tonight, primarily the railroad's increased pressure tactics." Various voices rose, reporting incidents similar to what Margaret had described: supplies delayed, loans called in unexpectedly, minor vandalism. Ryder listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that suggested a keen mind behind his cowboy exterior. "What about legal recourse?" someone asked. "Surely these acts constitute harassment," Judge Foster shook his head. "Without direct evidence linking the railroad to these incidents, our hands are tied legally. So we just wait until someone's shop burns down with them inside it," demanded a red-faced man near the front. "Hollister as much as threatened my wife yesterday. We need to stand together," Ryder said, his calm voice cutting through the rising tension. "That's what they don't expect. Divide and conquer is their strategy. If we support each other, share supplies, provide manpower when needed, we can outlast them." "Easy for you to say, Quinn," retorted a thin man with spectacles. "Your land is outside town. You don't have a business to protect." Ryder's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "My stake in this fight is just as real as yours, Henderson, and I've put my money and time where my mouth is." Judge Foster intervened before the exchange could heat further. "Ryder's right about standing together. Tonight, I want to establish a formal alliance with regular meetings, a shared emergency fund, and coordinated responses to any further incidents." The discussion continued, growing more detailed and practical. Penelope found herself impressed by the community's resilience and determination. These weren't helpless victims. They were fighters protecting their homes and livelihoods. Throughout the meeting, she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Ryder. He spoke little, but when he did, others listened. There was natural leadership in his bearing, not the pompous authority of men like Victor Hollister, but the quiet confidence of someone who had earned respect through actions rather than words. When the meeting concluded, people lingered in small groups, conversing earnestly. Margaret was immediately drawn into discussion with Judge Foster and several others, leaving Penelope momentarily alone. She was considering whether to join them when Ryder approached. "Miss Price," he said, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "You're settling in all right with your aunt?" "Yes, thank you," she replied, suddenly aware of how close he stood. "She's been very welcoming." Ryder nodded, his eyes searching her face. "She tell you about me and your cousin?" The direct question caught Penelope off guard, but she appreciated his straightforwardness. "Yes." "I'm sorry for what happened." A fleeting grimace crossed his features. "Ancient history now." He glanced around the room, then back at her. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were doing all right after our adventure. Doesn't seem like you traded one set of troubles for an easier life." "I'm beginning to think there's no such thing as an easy life," Penelope said with a small smile. "But I'm not afraid of difficulties, Mr. Quinn." "I noticed that on the mountain," he replied, a hint of admiration in his tone. "Most women would have been hysterical with a wagon hanging off a cliff." "Most women are stronger than men give them credit for," she countered. That drew a genuine smile from him, the first she'd seen that fully reached his eyes. "Fair point, Miss Price." Margaret appeared at Penelope's elbow. "Ryder, thank you for all your work organizing tonight. Judge Foster mentioned you've had more trouble at your property." The smile faded from Ryder's face. "Nothing I can't handle. Some fences cut, cattle scattered. Found tracks of 3 riders but couldn't identify them." Margaret frowned. "That's escalating from what they've done before." "Which is why I'll be staying closer to town for a while," Ryder said grimly. "Can't drive cattle and protect my land at the same time." His gaze shifted back to Penelope. "Ladies, if you'll excuse me, I need to speak with Sheriff Miller before he leaves." As he moved away, Margaret gave Penelope a speculative look. "He seems quite concerned about your welfare." "He's just being polite," Penelope said quickly, "after helping me on the road." Her aunt's expression suggested she wasn't convinced, but she merely said, "We should head home. It's getting late, and tomorrow will be busy." The walk home took them past the riverfront, where the railroad's existing facilities sprawled along the banks of the Missouri. Even at night, the area hummed with activity, workers loading and unloading cargo, the distant whistle of a locomotive, the clank of machinery. Progress, undeniably, but at what cost to the people whose lives were being upended? "The railroad is necessary," Margaret said, following Penelope's gaze. "No one disputes that. But there's plenty of land south of town where they could expand. They want our properties because they're already developed, saving them the cost of building from scratch." "What will happen if they can't buy everyone out?" Penelope asked. Margaret's expression was grim in the lamplight. "Eventually they'll either give up and build elsewhere, or..." She didn't finish the sentence. Or they'll find ways to force people out, Penelope completed quietly. Yes, but we're not there yet. And now we have you another clever Price woman to help us strategize. Margaret squeezed her arm affectionately. I'm so glad you're here, Penelope, not just for the help in the shop. It's been lonely since your uncle passed. The simple statement touched Penelope deeply. She had been so focused on her own losses and challenges that she hadn't fully considered her aunt's situation. Widowed, running a business alone, fighting powerful interests that threatened her livelihood. Yet Margaret had opened her home without hesitation, offering Penelope sanctuary when she needed it most. I'm glad to be here too, she said, meaning it. The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Mornings and afternoons were spent in the shop, learning the millinery trade from Margaret and Emily. Penelope discovered she had a talent for design, creating hat trimmings that drew admiring comments from customers. Evenings were quiet affairs, with Penelope and her aunt sharing dinner and conversation in the cozy apartment above the shop. Ryder Quinn did not appear during that time, though Penelope often found herself glancing out the shop windows, half expecting to see him passing by. She told herself it was merely friendly concern after their shared adventure, nothing more. On Saturday, a week after her arrival in Council Bluffs, Margaret announced they would close the shop early. There's a social at the church tonight, she explained. Nothing formal, just music, food, and conversation. It would be a good opportunity for you to meet more of the community. Penelope hesitated. In Boston, such gatherings had become excruciating after her father's death and broken engagement, filled with pitying glances and whispered comments. But Council Bluffs wasn't Boston, and she was no longer the disgraced daughter of a bankrupt businessman. That sounds lovely, she said finally. Though I'm afraid I don't have anything suitable to wear. Margaret smiled. I thought of that. Come upstairs, I have something to show you. In her bedroom, Margaret opened a trunk and carefully lifted out a dress of deep green silk. I've been working on this in the evenings, she said, holding it up. It may need a few adjustments, but I think it will suit you. Penelope touched the fabric with reverent fingers. The dress was exquisite, simply cut, but elegantly detailed with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Aunt Margaret, it's beautiful, but I can't accept such a gift. Nonsense, Margaret said firmly. What's the point of having a niece if I can't spoil her occasionally? Besides, you've earned it with your work in the shop. The dress fit perfectly, needing only a slight adjustment to the hem. When Penelope looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the travel-worn woman who had arrived in Council Bluffs a week ago. In her place stood someone new, still herself, but somehow more. The church social was held in the parish hall, a large room already buzzing with conversation and laughter when they arrived. A small group of musicians played in one corner, while tables laden with food lined the walls. Children darted between groups of adults, adding to the cheerful chaos. Margaret was immediately surrounded by friends, introducing Penelope to so many people that names and faces began to blur together. Everyone was welcoming, though Penelope noticed the same curious glances she'd encountered in the shop, often accompanied by furtive whispers once she moved on. Don't mind them, said a friendly voice at her elbow. Emily Foster appeared, looking pretty in a blue dress, her arm linked with a young man she introduced as her fiancé, Thomas Wright. They're just excited to have fresh gossip. Am I such interesting gossip? Penelope asked with a smile. Thomas, a tall young man with an open, honest face, laughed. In a town like this, a beautiful stranger who arrived with Ryder Quinn after being rescued on Widowmaker Pass, you'll be the talk of Council Bluffs for months. Penelope felt her cheeks warm. I'm hardly a stranger now, and Mr. Quinn was simply being gentlemanly. Emily and Thomas exchanged knowing glances that Penelope pretended not to notice. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about their upcoming wedding plans. As they chatted, the door to the hall opened, and a ripple of reaction passed through the crowd. Penelope turned to see Ryder Quinn entering, accompanied by an elderly man she recognized from the meeting at the Mitchell Hotel. Like that night, Ryder was dressed in town clothes rather than his trail gear, though he still wore his distinctive hat. His eyes scanned the room, pausing when they found her. A subtle change passed over his features, surprise, perhaps, at seeing her in the green dress instead of her usual work attire. He nodded in acknowledgement but made no move to approach, instead following his companion to greet the pastor. "He doesn't usually come to these events," Emily murmured, following Penelope's gaze. "Not since Louisa." "Emily," Thomas chided gently, "that's none of our business." Emily had the grace to look abashed. "You're right. I'm sorry, Penelope, I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," Penelope assured her, though she felt a twinge of discomfort at being the subject of such speculation. "I barely know Mr. Quinn. Our paths simply happened to cross at a fortunate moment." The evening progressed pleasantly. Penelope found herself drawn into several conversations, discussing everything from the latest fashions, where her Boston background gave her some authority, to the upcoming Harvest Festival. She danced twice, once with Thomas, at Emily's insistence, and once with Judge Foster, who proved surprisingly spry for his age. Throughout, she was aware of Ryder's presence across the room. He seemed to keep to the edges of the gathering, conversing with a few men but mostly observing. Not once did their paths directly cross, which Penelope told herself was for the best. The last thing she needed was to fuel more gossip. As the evening was winding down, Margaret approached, looking troubled. "Penelope, I need to return to the shop. Mrs. Wilson sent word that her hat isn't quite right and she needs it for church tomorrow." "I'll come with you," Penelope offered immediately. No, stay and enjoy yourself. Emily and Thomas can see you home later." Margaret patted her arm. "It's just a small adjustment, and you've been working so hard all week. You deserve some enjoyment." Before Penelope could protest further, her aunt was gone. She stood uncertainly for a moment, suddenly feeling out of place without Margaret's steadying presence. "Your aunt left you to fend for yourself." The deep voice behind her made Penelope turn quickly. Ryder Quinn stood there, hat in hand, a question in his eyes. "Just briefly," she explained. "A customer needs an adjustment to a hat. Emily and Thomas will see me home." Ryder glanced across the room to where Emily and Thomas were deep in conversation with his elderly friend. They seemed occupied at the moment. He hesitated, then added, "I was about to leave myself. Would you allow me to escort you home instead? Save them the trouble." Penelope knew she should decline. Walking home alone with Ryder would certainly set tongues wagging even more than they already were. But something in his expression, a mixture of uncertainty and hope, made her hesitate. "That would be kind of you," she heard herself say. "If you're sure it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," he replied, a hint of relief in his voice. "Let me tell Judge Williams I'm leaving and we can go." Outside, the night was clear and cool, the streets of Council Bluffs quieter than during the day but not deserted. Gas lamps cast pools of yellow light at intervals, illuminating their path back toward Front Street. They walked in silence for a few moments, Ryder shortening his stride to match hers. Finally, he spoke. "That color suits you. The dress." The simple compliment pleased her more than it should have. "Thank you. My aunt made it for me. Maggie always did have a good eye." He glanced sideways at her. "You're settling in well here, better than I expected," Penelope admitted. "The work is interesting and everyone has been kind." Even with the railroad situation, she nodded. That's troubling, certainly, but it helps to feel useful, to be part of something important. They turned onto Front Street, the shop now visible ahead. Ryder slowed his pace slightly. "Miss Price, Penelope," he said, his voice lower, "there's something I should tell you." Her heart quickened at his use of her first name. Yes, the railroad situation is worse than what was discussed at the meeting. His expression was grave in the lamplight. There have been threats, not just property damage, but personal threats against some of the holdouts. Penelope felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Against my aunt. Not specifically, no, but she's one of the most vocal opponents." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "I'm concerned for both of you. The men Hollister hires aren't known for their restraint." "What can we do?" Penelope asked, her mind racing through possibilities. "Be vigilant. Don't go out alone at night if possible." His eyes met hers, intense and worried. "And know that I'm watching out for you, for all the shopkeepers." The sincerity in his voice touched her. This man, who barely knew her, was concerned for her safety. "Why do you care so much about this fight, Ryder? Your land is outside town, as that man Henderson pointed out." Ryder was quiet for a moment. "When I came to Council Bluffs 5 years ago, I had plans, dreams." A shadow crossed his face. "Those didn't work out. But this town, these people, they became important to me anyway. I won't stand by and watch them bullied by men who see nothing but dollar signs." The simple declaration revealed more about his character than hours of conversation might have. Penelope found herself studying his face in the dim light, the strong jaw, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, the mouth that seemed more accustomed to firmness than smiles. "That's admirable," she said softly. He looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what needs doing." They resumed walking, the shop now just a few yards away. "Will you tell your aunt what I said about being careful?" "Of course," Penelope promised. "Though I doubt she'll be surprised. Margaret strikes me as someone who doesn't miss much." "That she is," Ryder agreed with a hint of a smile. "One of the sharpest minds in Council Bluffs." They reached the shop door. Penelope turned to thank him for the escort, only to find him standing closer than she'd realized. For a breathless moment, something electric seemed to pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, of something neither was ready to name. Then Ryder stepped back, replacing his hat. "Good night, Miss Price. Please give my regards to your aunt." "Good night, Mr. Quinn," she replied, suddenly formal again. "And thank you." She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the night. Only when he was out of sight did she unlock the shop door and step inside. Margaret looked up from her work at the counter, a knowing expression on her face. "I see you found an escort after all." "Mr. Quinn was leaving at the same time," Penelope explained, trying to sound casual. "He offered to walk with me." "How considerate of him," Margaret said, returning to the hat she was adjusting. "And did you have a pleasant conversation?" Penelope hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "He warned me about the railroad situation. Said there have been personal threats against some of the holdouts." Margaret's hand stilled. "I see," she sighed. "I was hoping to spare you that particular worry for a little longer. You knew, I suspected. Victor Hollister isn't subtle in his methods." Margaret set the hat aside and faced Penelope directly. "I should have been more forthcoming with you. I didn't want to frighten you so soon after your arrival." "I'm not frightened," Penelope said firmly. "I'm concerned, yes, but mostly I'm angry that such tactics are being employed and apparently tolerated." A smile touched Margaret's lips. "You sound like your mother." She never could abide bullies either. She picked up the hat again. "Well, now that you know, we can be more open about our precautions. I've been keeping a loaded Derringer in the shop drawer since this business began." The casual mention of a weapon surprised Penelope. Her aunt had always seemed the epitome of genteel propriety. "Have you ever had to use it?" "Thankfully, no, but the West teaches you to be prepared." Margaret finished her adjustment and held up the hat for inspection. "There. Mrs. Wilson will be the envy of the congregation tomorrow." She glanced at Penelope. "Now tell me more about your walk with Ryder Quinn." Despite her attempt at an innocent tone, Penelope recognized the spark of interest in her aunt's eyes. "There's nothing to tell. He was perfectly gentlemanly." "I never doubted that," Margaret replied. "Ryder has always been a gentleman. It's one of his most appealing qualities." She began putting away her sewing materials. "You know, he hasn't escorted any woman anywhere since Louisa left, not to my knowledge anyway." Penelope felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure you're reading too much into a simple courtesy." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded, though her expression suggested otherwise. "But I've known Ryder Quinn for 5 years, and simple courtesy doesn't usually have him looking at someone the way he was looking at you tonight." Before Penelope could formulate a response, Margaret continued in a more serious tone. "Just be careful with your heart, dear. Ryder is a good man, one of the best, but he was deeply hurt by what happened with Louisa. I'm not sure he's fully recovered, even after all this time." The warning, gently delivered, nevertheless made Penelope defensive. "I assure you, Aunt Margaret, my heart is not at risk. I came to Council Bluffs to start anew, not to entangle myself in another romantic disappointment." Margaret's expression softened. "Of course. Forgive an old woman's meddling." She squeezed Penelope's hand. "Now let's get some rest. Sunday is always busy after church lets out." Later, lying in her bed, Penelope found herself replaying the evening's events, particularly those quiet moments walking with Ryder. There had been something different in his manner tonight, a lowering of the guard he usually kept so firmly in place. What had changed? And why did it matter so much to her? Sunday morning dawned clear and bright. Penelope and Margaret attended church services, where Penelope noted with some amusement how many admiring glances were directed at Mrs. Wilson's newly adjusted hat. Afterward, they opened the shop for a few hours to catch the after-church trade, as Margaret had predicted. Late in the afternoon, as they were preparing to close, the door opened to admit Victor Hollister. Today he was accompanied by 2 men, one tall and thin with a scar across his cheek, the other stocky and expressionless. Neither looked like the type of associate a respectable businessman would choose. "Mrs. Patterson," Hollister said, his false smile in place. "Miss Price, I hope you've had a pleasant Sunday." "It was, until now," Margaret replied coolly. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hollister?" "We were just closing." Hollister's smile tightened. "I won't take much of your time. I merely wanted to inform you that the Railroads Board has authorized me to increase my offer for your property by 20%. He named a figure that made Penelope's eyebrows rise despite herself. Margaret didn't flinch. "The answer remains no, Mr. Hollister. This shop is not for sale at any price." The pretense of civility dropped from Hollister's face. "Mrs. Patterson, I urge you to reconsider. The railroad's expansion plans have been approved by the town council. Progress cannot be stopped for the sake of sentimentality." "Is that what you call it? Sentimentality?" Margaret stepped forward, her spine straight, her voice steady. "This shop has stood on this spot for 15 years. My husband built it with his own hands. I've built a reputation and a livelihood here. That's not sentimentality, Mr. Hollister, it's my life." The scar-faced man shifted slightly, his hand moving inside his coat in a way that made Penelope tense. Hollister noticed her reaction and smiled thinly. "My associates, Mr. Pierce and Mr. Donovan," he said with a casual wave. "Security consultants for the railroad. These are dangerous times after all. The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. Penelope moved closer to her aunt, anger replacing her initial fear. "I think you should leave now, Mr. Hollister. As my aunt said, we're closing." Hollister's gaze shifted to her, cold and calculating. "Miss Price, isn't it? So recently arrived from the East. It would be a shame if your new life here was disrupted by unfortunate events." "Are you threatening my niece, Victor?" Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. "Merely making an observation," Hollister replied smoothly. "Council Bluffs can be hospitable or hostile depending on one's choices." He adjusted his hat. "My offer remains open for 3 more days. After that, well, circumstances may change the value of your property." He nodded to his men, and they turned to leave. As they opened the door, they nearly collided with Ryder Quinn, who was just entering. For a moment, the 5 of them froze in tableau, Hollister and his men by the door, Ryder on the threshold, Penelope and Margaret behind the counter. "Quinn," Hollister acknowledged stiffly. "Hollister," Ryder replied, his gaze taking in the scene with shrewd assessment. "Bringing your hired muscle into a lady's shop now, that's low even for you." The scar-faced man Pierce took a step forward, but Hollister placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Mr. Quinn is simply concerned for his friends." The pause before the last word was deliberate. "We were just concluding our business." "Then don't let me delay you," Ryder said, stepping aside but maintaining a posture that suggested he was ready for trouble if it came. After they left, Ryder closed the door firmly behind them, his expression grim. "Are you ladies all right?" "Perfectly fine," Margaret said, though Penelope could see her hands trembling slightly as she began straightening items on the counter. "Hollister is all bluster." "Those men with him weren't bluster," Ryder observed darkly. "Pierce has a reputation from Colorado to the Mississippi, none of it good." He moved further into the shop, his concern evident. "What did he want?" "The usual," Margaret replied. "Offered more money, made veiled threats when I refused." She managed a tight smile. "Nothing we haven't heard before." Ryder's jaw clenched. "This is getting out of hand. First the vandalism at my place, now bringing hired guns into town." He looked between the 2 women. "I don't think either of you should be alone for a while, not until we sort this out." "We can hardly close the shop," Margaret pointed out practically, "and we live above it. Where else would we go?" "I don't know yet," Ryder admitted, "but I aim to figure something out." He turned to Penelope. "You were standing up to him when I arrived. That took courage." Penelope felt oddly flustered by his approval. It wasn't courage so much as anger, the way he spoke to Aunt Margaret. "Still," Ryder insisted, "many would have stayed quiet." There was something in his eyes as he looked at her, admiration, certainly, but something more too. Something that made her heart beat faster. Margaret watched their exchange with knowing eyes. "Ryder, were you looking for us specifically, or did you just happen by?" He shifted his attention to her with apparent reluctance. "Looking for you, actually. Judge Foster called another meeting for tonight. After what happened at the Wilson farm yesterday, he thinks we need to discuss more concrete actions." "What happened at the Wilson farm?" Penelope asked. Ryder hesitated, glancing at Margaret, who nodded for him to continue. "Their barn was burned to the ground last night. Nobody hurt, thankfully, but they lost 2 horses and all their feed for the winter." "That's terrible," Penelope exclaimed. "It's escalation," Ryder said grimly. "And it won't be the last unless we find a way to push back effectively." Margaret nodded decisively. "We'll be at the meeting." "What time?" 8 o'clock, same place." Ryder replaced his hat, preparing to leave. "I'll come by to escort you both there. With Hollister's men in town, I'd rather not take chances." After he left, Penelope turned to her aunt. "This is more serious than I realized." Margaret sighed, suddenly looking older. "Yes, it is. I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily, but She straightened her shoulders. Well, now you know, and I must say you're handling it with remarkable composure. I've had practice maintaining composure through difficult situations, Penelope said, thinking of the months after her father's death, when she'd faced creditors and social humiliation with her head held high. Margaret touched her cheek gently. Yes, I suppose you have. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. The simple statement, delivered with such sincerity, brought unexpected tears to Penelope's eyes. She blinked them away quickly. Thank you. That means more than I can say. Later that evening, Ryder arrived as promised to escort them to the meeting. He seemed preoccupied, his usual composure disrupted by an undercurrent of tension. Penelope found herself studying him as they walked, noting the alertness of his gaze as it scanned the streets, the way his hand stayed close to the revolver holstered at his side. "You're expecting trouble tonight?" she asked quietly, falling into step beside him while Margaret walked slightly ahead. "I always expect trouble," he replied with a grim smile. "That way, I'm rarely disappointed." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Penelope couldn't help but smile at his dry humor. A practical philosophy. Ryder glanced down at her, his expression softening momentarily. "Been serving me well for 30 years. The meeting at the Mitchell Hotel was more crowded than the previous one, the atmosphere charged with anxiety and anger. Judge Foster had difficulty bringing the room to order, as several people spoke at once about the Wilson Farm incident and other new concerns. "Please, everyone," the judge finally commanded, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to be organized if we're to be effective." Gradually, the room quieted. Foster nodded his thanks and continued. "As you all know, the situation has escalated beyond property damage to open intimidation. Mrs. Wilson believes the fire at their farm was deliberately set, though she has no proof. Proof be damned," shouted the red-faced man Penelope remembered from the previous meeting. "We all know who's behind it." Murmurs of agreement swept the room. Foster raised his hands for silence again. "Of course we do, Peter. But knowing and proving are different matters, especially when the sheriff and mayor are reluctant to act without evidence." "Then we need to get evidence," Ryder said from his position near the door. All heads turned toward him. "Catch them in the act. Document the connections between Hollister and these security consultants he's brought to town." "And how do you propose we do that?" asked Henderson, the thin man who had challenged Ryder at the previous meeting. "Surveillance," Ryder replied simply. "We take shifts watching key properties. Record comings and goings. Follow Hollister's men when possible, see who they meet with." Foster nodded thoughtfully. "That has merit, but it would require significant manpower." "We have the people right here," Ryder countered, gesturing around the room. "And it's better than sitting and waiting for the next attack." Discussion erupted again, more focused now. Gradually, a plan took shape. Volunteers would organize into teams, each responsible for watching certain areas or following specific individuals. Penelope listened with growing admiration for the community's determination and resourcefulness. Margaret leaned over to whisper, "This is how the West was settled, people working together against common threats." Eastern newspapers liked to write about lone heroes, but it was really communities that made the difference. Penelope nodded, understanding better now why her aunt had chosen to stay in Council Bluffs despite the hardships. There was something powerful in this shared purpose, this collective resolve. As the meeting concluded, teams were assigned and schedules created. Penelope was surprised when Margaret volunteered them both for a surveillance shift. "Are you sure?" Penelope whispered. "I don't have any experience with this sort of thing," Margaret smiled. "It's just watching and recording, dear. Nothing dangerous." She glanced meaningfully at Ryder, who was deep in conversation with Judge Foster. Besides, I suspect we'll have capable assistance if needed. Her prediction proved accurate. When they prepared to leave, Ryder approached. I've been assigned to coordinate the team watching Front Street, he told them. That includes your shop. How convenient, Margaret murmured with a barely suppressed smile that made Penelope want to sink through the floor. To Ryder, she added, we've volunteered for the midnight to dawn shift tomorrow. Will that work with your schedule? If Ryder noticed the matchmaking undertone in Margaret's voice, he gave no sign. I'll be there. But neither of you should be out on the streets at night. We can set up the observation post in your apartment, if you're willing. The view from your windows covers most of Front Street. A sensible suggestion, Margaret agreed readily. Penelope and I will take turns at the window while you rest. Ryder shook his head firmly. I won't be resting. My job is to keep moving between observation points, checking in with all the teams. Then we'll have coffee waiting when you check in with us, Margaret said with a tone that brooked no argument.